Alright, I've been fighting an intermittent situation here where the car doesn't always start up. I noticed that sometimes it'll crank, 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 and as soon as you let go of the ignition switch out of the start detent into the run detent, it fires right off. So, I know the fuel pressure is okay in the start mode. How do I know that? I hooked up a pressure gauge to the fuel line. I disengaged the starter by pulling the starter solenoid wire off, and then I turn it to start and the pressure comes right up. So it's getting fuel pressure in the start mode. I know that. So that leaves me with an ignition issue or a fuel injector issue. I checked the ignition issue by pulling this wire off right here, well actually from the distributor, and laying it up here on the shock tower where I can see it. And while I'm starting the car, you can clearly see a nice fat spark. So it's getting plenty of spark in the start mode. So the engine's cranking and the ignition coil is firing. So that leads me to think something's happening maybe at the fuel injectors. Now what I just did a few minutes ago was I hooked up a remote starter. I put the ignition into the on position and I disengaged the spark because I didn't want it to I didn't want it to start, and I cranked the engine over with a remote starter. Do I have it here somewhere? While that was doing that, I used my stethoscope and I listened at the injector. The idea is while the engine's cranking and the ignition is on, I'm basically bypassing the start circuit of the ignition switch. I could hear the ticking coming from the injectors. So I said, okay, the injectors are definitely firing in the run position. So my next step I'm going to do is I'm going to disable the ignition again, only this time I have somebody, instead of using a remote switch to crank the engine over and thereby fire off the, tell the ECU it's time to turn the injectors on and off, I'm going to use a start switch to do it, in other words, the way it's supposed to be. With the ignition disabled, I'm hoping that if I can go in here and see if I'm still getting injector pulses or not. So that'll be the next step to diagnose why it starts when I release from the start position, goes to the run, it instantly fires off. More later.